One city falls, an entire invasion collapses, and the man in the Kremlin just watched his master plan to capture Ukraine's capital disintegrate because he made one catastrophic miscalculation in a place most people have never even heard of. Kupiansk wasn't supposed to matter. It was a sideshow, a distraction, a city already half destroyed. But what happened there in May didn't just change the Eastern Front. It shattered Putin's northern dream before a single soldier even crossed the border toward Kiev. Here's what the Kremlin's generals won't tell you. For months, Russian military planners had been drawing red lines on secret maps through the Chernihiv forests, the shortest route to Ukraine's heart. 100,000 troops were being assembled in silence. Elite units, contract soldiers, the best tanks Russia still had operational. The plan was elegant in its brutality: stabilize the east, shift everything north, punch through the forests, and put a knife to Kiev's throat before NATO could blink. Everything was moving according to schedule. And then Ukrainian intelligence did something that military historians are going to study for decades. They identified the one weakness Putin's planners never saw coming. The Eastern Front wasn't stable. It was a house of cards, and Ukraine was about to kick the legs out from under it at precisely the moment Russia needed it most. While Moscow was secretly shuffling divisions north and rehearsing victory parades, Ukraine's general staff was watching the troop movements in real time and making preparations of their own. The target was Kupiansk, a battered city on the Oskil River that Russian forces had occupied and fortified for months. On paper, it looked like a hard target. Buildings converted into concrete bunkers, underground positions. Experienced Russian units dug in deep, but Ukrainian military intelligence had spent months mapping every Russian position, every supply route, every weakness in the occupation. The Cartier National Guard Brigade moved into position as the primary strike force. Mechanized units from the 10th Army Corps deployed along the eastern bank of the river, ready to cut off retreat routes. FPV drone operators, especially the legendary Achilles unit, positioned themselves to hunt any Russian soldier who tried to escape. Heavy mechanized brigades waited in reserve for coordinated night operations. Ukraine wasn't just planning an assault. They were planning a surgical elimination of every organized Russian element in the city, and they were waiting for the exact moment when it would hurt Moscow the most. That moment came when the Ukrainian general staff pressed the button on an operation that had been months in the making. Russian forces inside Kupiansk, who had turned apartment blocks and hospitals into fortified positions, suddenly found themselves surrounded from every direction. Coordinated assaults hit simultaneously across multiple axes. The goal wasn't just to push the Russians out, it was to eliminate their ability to maneuver, to coordinate, to fight as a cohesive force. And it worked with brutal efficiency. According to analysis from the Institute for the Study of War, by May the Russian army no longer held any consolidated positions inside Kupiansk, not a single block where they could mount organized resistance. The pressure was so intense that Russian commanders lost control of their units entirely. Soldiers who had been told to hold the city at all costs were fleeing in panic without orders, abandoning equipment, leaving wounded comrades behind. By the second half of May, the Russian infiltration rate inside the city had been reduced to zero. Ukraine declared absolute control, but the most important target still remained. Ukrainian intelligence had confirmed the location of the last major Russian holdout in the city center. Approximately 20 Russian soldiers had barricaded themselves inside the Kupiansk Central District Hospital building, using the thick concrete walls and underground passages as a final refuge. Their logistics had been cut. Their communications were severed. But they had turned the hospital into a miniature fortress, and getting them out without leveling a civilian building required precision that most militaries couldn't execute. The Kupiansk Tactical Group conducted reconnaissance with drones first, mapping every entry point and identifying exactly where the Russians were hiding. Then they struck with guided munitions and heavy drone strikes, targeting structural weak points to collapse defensive positions without destroying the entire building. The Russian group inside was completely destroyed. With that final resistance point eliminated, no organized Russian military structure remained in the heart of Kupiansk. The city was cleared, and Moscow was about to realize what that actually meant. Because losing the center of Kupiansk forced the Russian command into desperation mode. In the second half of May, they stopped trying to retake the city with armored convoys or battalion-sized assaults. Instead, they resorted to something that revealed just how badly their position had deteriorated. Micro-infiltration tactics, 1 or 2 soldiers at a time, trying to sneak back into the city using forest paths, small boats, mined terrain, even old industrial pipelines running under the Oskil River. The idea was to create chaos without being detected by Ukrainian heavy weapons and radar systems. Russian infantry attempted to use massive underground pipes as secret tunnels, crawling through darkness to reach Ukrainian lines. But Ukraine's FPV drone operators were waiting. Thermal cameras detected every attempt. Russian soldiers hiding in pipes, crouched in tree hollows, wading through shallow water in the dead of night. Every single one was tracked, and every single one was neutralized. FPV drones equipped with explosive payloads dove into pipe entrances with millimeter precision. Infiltrators were destroyed in seconds. The gates to Kupiansk were welded shut, and the Kremlin could not tolerate the humiliation. On May 16th, Russian Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, stood in front of commanders from the Western Military District and made exaggerated claims about the situation in Kupiansk. He insisted Russian forces still held strategic positions. He painted a picture of stability and control, and within hours, his claims were demolished by FPV drone footage from the ground and independent military analysts who had been tracking the battle in real time. Moscow's propaganda collapsed under the weight of battlefield reality. The picture was undeniable. Kiev had turned Russia's Kupiansk operation into a disaster, but Ukraine didn't stop at the city center. Cleanup operations expanded into surrounding villages. Russian holdouts were cleared from strategic settlements, and Kiev began constructing strong defensive lines in those areas, fortifying gains and preparing for the next phase. The question everyone started asking was simple: how did the Russian army fail this badly? The answer goes back further than most people realize. The spectacular success in May was built on foundations laid in January and February of that year. When the Oskil River froze in the winter months, initial clashes began, and the Ukrainian army exercised something that wins wars more than firepower ever can: strategic patience. In January, Ukrainian forces raised the flag over the city council building, a symbolic move that paralyzed Russian morale. By February, Viktor Tryhubov, spokesperson for Ukrainian Joint Forces, publicly stated that reliable control had been established inside the city. Those winter months were the groundwork. The determination Ukraine showed in January and February made the complete liberation in May inevitable. It was a long-term, meticulously planned military strategy that the world is only now beginning to fully appreciate, and the cost to Russia went far beyond losing a single city. During the process of clearing Kupiansk in May, Russia lost some of its most elite combat formations. The 6th Combined Arms Army of the Leningrad Military District, the 1st Guards Tank Army of the Moscow Military District. These weren't conscript units or hastily assembled reserves. These were Russia's premier forces, equipped with T-90M tanks, and staffed with trained contract soldiers. The 27th Separate Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade, one of the Defense Ministry's most trusted units, suffered catastrophic losses against Ukrainian tactical maneuvers. The 121st and 122nd Regiments of the 68th Motorized Rifle Division had their logistics severed at river bridgeheads and were completely neutralized by coordinated Ukrainian artillery. The 153rd Tank Regiment of the 47th Tank Division, Russia's most powerful armored force on that front, lost the majority of its vehicles to FPV drone strikes. This wasn't just a tactical defeat. It was the destruction of strategic reserves that Moscow had been counting on for operations across the entire theater. The manpower Russia lost in Kupiansk was supposed to be deployed north. The equipment destroyed in those streets was meant to punch through Ukrainian defenses toward Kiev. Instead, it became scrap metal, and the Kremlin was forced to deplete northern reserves just to replace what it lost in the east. Which brings us to what was happening on Ukraine's northern border while Kupiansk was falling. On May 20th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held a classified intelligence briefing. Satellite images and intercepted communications revealed what Moscow had been preparing in secret: 5 different military scenarios to occupy Kiev via the Chernihiv region, a massive invasion force of 100,000 troops being quietly mobilized, joint nuclear exercises with Belarus starting on May 18th, designed to pressure Minsk into cooperation and intimidate Ukraine into negotiations. The threat was real. Ukrainian Chief of General Staff Oleksandr Syrsky publicly confirmed that the northern front could expand dramatically. Russia was trying to put Ukraine between two fires: crush them in the east, invade from the north, force capitulation. It was a plan that might have worked if one critical assumption had held true, that the eastern front would remain stable long enough for Moscow to shift forces north. But Ukraine's victory in Kupiansk shattered that assumption completely. Because once Kupiansk was cleared, thousands of experienced Ukrainian soldiers who had just fought one of the most intense urban battles of the war became available for redeployment. These weren't fresh conscripts. They were battle-hardened troops who had mastered modern urban warfare, FPV drone coordination, and combined arms operations under fire. The 13th National Guard Brigade Cartier, the main strike force in Kupiansk, could now rotate to support the north. Mechanized brigades from the 10th Army Corps that had fought along the Oskil River, other successful units that had written their names into Ukrainian military history during the May operation. All of them were now free to reinforce the northern defenses. With these redeployments, Ukrainian military strength in the Chernihiv region surged to an estimated 50 to 55,000 troops. In military terms, this represents a critical operational success. The flexibility gained from victory in the east was immediately transferred to the northern threat, Ukraine turned momentum into an insurmountable defensive barrier. And that barrier was more than just manpower. The forces deploying to Chernihiv were moving behind an enormous fortification line stretching over 300 kilometers from the Kiev reservoir to Sumy. This wasn't a hastily dug trench system. It was a layered defensive network built with hard lessons from the failed Russian offensive of 2022. More than 2,130 reinforced concrete bunkers, each capable of housing a fire team connected by underground tunnels. Special steel-reinforced structures designed to withstand prolonged artillery bombardment. Over 3,000 kilometers of anti-tank ditches dug along the border. Thousands of concrete dragon's teeth pyramids positioned behind the ditches to trap and immobilize armored vehicles. Pillboxes built by military engineers and private contractors, buried into the ground to minimize exposure to Russian artillery. Hidden underground ammunition depots positioned between trench lines to sustain prolonged defense. And advanced electronic warfare systems deployed up to 100 kilometers deep from the border, blunting Russia's advantage in air reconnaissance and drone operations. This fortification network represented a defensive multiplier that changes the entire calculus of an offensive. According to universal principles of military strategy, breaching a layered defensive line fortified with concrete positions and minefields is extraordinarily difficult and costly. A defensive force positioned behind such infrastructure, with geographical advantage, drone networks, and artillery superiority, increases its effective combat power exponentially. Successfully breaching this kind of defense typically requires the attacking side to have a numerical advantage of 3 to 5 times, along with robust logistical support and air superiority. Which means Russia's planned force of 100,000 troops may not be sufficient, especially after what happened in Kupiansk. Because the elite brigades Moscow was counting on for the northern push, the ones equipped with modern tanks and trained soldiers, were shattered in the east during May. The armored capacity Russia planned to use in Chernihiv was destroyed in the streets of Kupiansk. The 100,000-strong force that was supposed to steamroll through the forest toward Kiev is now facing a qualitative and quantitative crisis. The plan that looked achievable on paper in March has become a strategic nightmare by June. The overall picture reveals something that should terrify Russian military planners. Ukraine's May cleanup operation in Kupiansk didn't just liberate one city. It paralyzed Moscow's ability to execute its northern invasion scenario. While the Kremlin was preparing a surprise attack through Chernihiv, Ukraine struck first in the east, destroying the strategic reserves and elite units that offensive depended on. The Russian forces annihilated in Kupiansk city center and central hospital weren't just casualties. They were the key to unlocking the northern front. Without them, the Kremlin's entire strategic calculus collapses. Today, Kupiansk is cleared. An estimated 55,000 Ukrainian troops are entrenched behind 300 kilometers of fortified defensive lines in Chernihiv. Russia's dream of reaching Kiev with its 100,000-man army now faces layered trenches, concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth, electronic warfare systems, and an experienced, motivated defensive force that just proved it can dismantle elite Russian units in urban combat. The northern offensive that was supposed to force Ukraine to the negotiating table is no longer a realistic military option. It's a potential catastrophe waiting to happen. In this new phase of the war, the most important question isn't whether Russian generals will dare to launch the northern attack. It's when they'll be forced to admit that their own strategic propaganda has trapped them. The Ukrainian army's flawless execution in Kupiansk during May didn't just lock the gates to the north. It dispelled the shadow hanging over Kiev from the eastern front lines. Putin's greatest ambition, the plan to reach Ukraine's capital and dictate terms, was destroyed by his own weapon at the moment he trusted it most. The time lost trying to hold Kupiansk obliterated the speed he needed in the north. The ambush he thought he was setting in the Chernihiv forests was countered by the trap Ukraine set in the east. The cleansing of one battered city changed the fate of a capital. Moscow no longer has the fresh troops, the strategic surprise, or the operational tempo it needs. Ukraine, by contrast, has seized the initiative on both fronts, deepened its defensive infrastructure, and turned time into an ally. The Kremlin's blitzkrieg fantasies have devolved into a grinding war of attrition that Russia is losing. All eyes remain on the north. But the real question hanging over this war is no longer about victory. It's about how the Kremlin will choose to frame its defeat. Does Putin still believe he can win? Or is he simply deciding which loss he can survive politically? Because the battlefield has already delivered its verdict.